Inspired Pilot Podcast, episode 10.
Good, careful, precise preparation for every flight.
Inspiring stories from inspiring pilots from around the world. Welcome to the Inspired Pilot Podcast with your host, Marvin Robinson.
Okay, welcome to the Inspired Pilot Podcast. This is Marvin Robinson, and I'm super excited to introduce today's featured inspiring pilot, 𝗂𝗶𝗴𝗰𝗀. Welcome, Polly, to the show. Are you ready to inspire today?
Well, I'm looking forward to it. I'm sure it'll be great fun, and I hope I can inspire. It would be a great honour to do so.
Fantastic. It may have been over 20 years since Vacher MBE gained her pilot's license, but she sure has packed in a lot of flying into those years. Polly achieved incredible feats as she circumnavigated Australia, the United States, and the entire globe. In 2004, she became the first solo woman to fly over the polar regions, and she did all this to gain scholarships for the disabled. In 2007, she completed the Wings Around Britain Challenge, where she landed at all the airfields in the UK Jeppesen VFR Manual. An admirable achievement has seen Polly rewarded with an MBE for her services to charity. Okay, I've given our listeners, the Inspired Pilots, probably the briefest overview of some incredible feats of aviation. We definitely will go into your journey, but before that, Polly, so we can get to know you a little bit more, can you tell us a bit about yourself personally, where you're from, and briefly give us an overview of what you're doing aviation-wise now?
Right, well, I was born in South Devon and always think of myself as a Devonshire lass, rosy cheeks, country girl. And I trained originally as a physiotherapist when I left school and worked for a couple of years, got married, had children, and at the same time trained as a music teacher, which was really my favourite career. And I spent the next 20 odd years teaching music. But underneath, I'd always wanted to learn to fly. And at first I couldn't afford it. And then after that, I had children and I sort of mistakenly thought it was a dangerous thing to do. So I didn't learn while I had young children. And then suddenly life went on and we were able to afford it and the children were grown up. And I was 50 at the time and we were living in Australia. And both my husband and I took our first flying lesson on the first day in Canberra, on the first flying lesson together in Canberra in Australia, where we were living for 2 years.
Fantastic. Okay, so on the Inspired Pilot Podcast, we delve into the journey of our featured inspiring pilot, which is you, Polly. Every journey does have to start somewhere. So tell us that story of you in Australia and how you first got involved and wanting to be a pilot.
Well, I've always wanted to fly, and I can remember as a child sort of trying to grow wings and not quite understanding why if I jumped off a chair I didn't actually fly. But and then when I was about 19 and a student in London, a friend of mine paid for me to have a glider flight, and I can remember that every second of that flight. It was just magical, but at the time I couldn't afford to go on doing it, so sort of put it at the back of my mind. And then in 1989, a friend of mine told me that I could do a skydive attached to an instructor. And I thought, wow, that sounds great fun. But it cost £75. And I thought that's a lot of money to spend on one skydive. And then a friend suggested I did it to raise some money for charity. And so she did all the sort of getting all the sponsors. And I did the skydive, and I got totally hooked on skydiving after that one jump and had to go and learn to be a skydiver. And I now have 245 skydives in my logbook. But nothing on earth would persuade my husband, Peter, to leap out of a perfectly serviceable airplane, which some of your listeners may agree with. And so life is a compromise, and we decided that we would both learn to fly together when we lived in Canberra.
Fantastic. I think I'm with Peter on this one. There's not a chance that I'll be jumping out of any aircraft while it's still serviceable anyway.
We should give it a try sometime, Marvin.
Maybe someone will have to push me then. That'll be it then. Okay, so that was back in 1989. So when you moved to Australia, what year was that?
1994. And we stayed there for the 1994-1995, and we both obtained our license in that time. And then before we left Australia, we hired a little aeroplane, a 4-seater single-engine 𝗘𝗶𝗶𝗀𝗃, and we flew it together around the whole circumference of Australia, up the centre to Alice Springs and Ayers Rock, and across the Simpson Desert. And we were very new pilots. We only had 80 hours of experience each. And it was a most amazing experience for us to do this. And it really gave me my love of long distance flying.
Wow, that sounds amazing. And just going back when you were learning to fly, so flying has its own challenges, but no more so than, when you're actually learning. So for the benefit of someone thinking about learning how to fly or someone currently in their training, can you go back to possibly some challenges that you experienced? What did you find most difficult when you were learning how to fly? And how did you overcome this?
I always thought that, I'm quite a good driver, and I thought, I'll find it quite easy to fly, just like driving in the sky. But it actually was quite different. Probably one of the most difficult things is to steer the aeroplane on the ground with your feet, because you use your rudder pedals to steer the aeroplane and not anything with your hands. So you want to steer like a steering wheel with the control column, but in fact, that isn't what you do. And it's very strange, that strange feeling. The most difficult thing about learning to fly, I think, is actually learning to land the aeroplane without crashing it. And it's pretty scary stuff. And you just have to keep on thinking about it and working out how to do it, listening to your instructor until you can do it. Once you can do it, then you do your first solo, and that really is very scary but also very exciting. And I think if you speak to any pilot, they'll all be able to recall their first solo. It is a very special moment.
Talking about that, could you take us through your memory of your first solo?
My first solo was, I took off. I was at Canberra. There's one very big runway where, unless the winds are really impossible, the big jets land on, and one cross runway, which is smaller, and generally if the winds are okay, then you use the smaller runway for the lighter aircraft. So I took off on the smaller runway. It's not that small, but it's smaller than the big one, and I was just airborne, and there are two thoughts I can remember. One is, oh heavens, now I'm up here on my own, I've got to get this thing down, which is fairly scary. And the other thing is that I was in the middle of this circuit, which is all you have to do for your first solo, just go round the circuit and come back and land. In the middle of that, they changed runways. And I thought that my instructor had thought I was so bad at landing that he'd rung the control tower and told them to change runways because I would do better on the big runway.
Fantastic.
But in fact, it wasn't anything to do with that at all. It was to do with the wind. So I was just, it was a difficult thing. I had to do some quick working out and things, but I'm here to tell the tale. That's the important thing.
There you go. That was your first challenge that you overcome right from the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, that brings me, Marvin, to the whole purpose of all my flying is that we are very involved with flying scholarships for the disabled, which uses the challenge of learning to fly to help people with disabilities to come to terms with their disabilities through facing this challenge and overcoming it. And the most exciting time for all pilots is the first solo, and to see someone maybe who's a paraplegic, can't use their legs, or somebody who's missing an arm or got cerebral palsy, to actually go solo for the first time and to see their face when they land is worth it all. And it's a very life-changing experience, and particularly for people who are trying to overcome disability in whatever way they are disabled.
Wow, using the power of flight and the sensory overloads, which taking an aircraft off the ground and putting it back on again for very good use there. So, wow, that's really nice.
Well, I think it helps to give you a lot of confidence and builds up your self-esteem. And the result of the Flying Scholarship Programme is that it helps disabled people to get back into the workplace, or to get into the workplace for the first time, and to make a life for themselves. And it's very, very exciting and spectacular to watch, and the courage that this brings out in people with some pretty awful disabilities, and how they overcome it through this challenge is fantastic.
Wow. I think we're going to touch a bit on that slightly when we go through your journey. But before that, let's have a look at aircraft types. So how many different aircraft types have you flown, and what aircraft, I think I may know the answer to this, do you hold the closest to your heart, and why?
Well, I mentioned to you earlier that the aircraft we rented or hired to fly around Australia was a Piper Cherokee Dakota, which is a 4-seater single-engine aircraft about the size of a sort of family saloon car, really, inside. And the amazing thing was we had this Piper Dakota flew around Australia, and when we came back to the UK, we saw advertised in a flying magazine an identical Piper Dakota for sale, and it was just 2 serial numbers away from the one we'd flown around Australia. So it sort of jumped out of the pages of the magazine and said, "Buy me." And that's exactly what we did. And that Piper Dakota is the aircraft I have today, which is nearly 20 years since I've had it now, and still fly it whenever I can. So it's obviously closest to my heart. But now you've asked, I was very, very fortunate when I took off for my first world flight, because the Royal Air Force sent a Harrier jump jet to escort my departure. And when I got back, they sent 2 to welcome me back. And then subsequently, they organised for me to have an hour's flight in a Harrier. And that was so exciting. And I actually had the controls for nearly the whole of that hour. Obviously, I didn't do all the bells and whistles and things, but it was great fun just to have the controls and fly it, all over the low level, and then zooming up to 20,000 feet in about 2 seconds. And it was very exciting.
Polly, I'll almost be forgiven to think that you actually think the Harrier jump jet's more exciting than your PA-28 Dakota.
Well, it was quite interesting because I had actually flown my PA-28 Dakota up to Cottesmore, where I actually then did my flight in the Harrier. And when I came to fly my Piper Dakota afterwards, I thought, gosh, this is even more difficult because the Harrier is so responsive. And my Piper Dakota seemed to wander around the sky a bit. But I love her. And we've got it's just like putting on a coat. When I get inside, I just get in and go fly, and it's great. And I still love to share it with everybody. And going back to the flying for disabled, when I did my round Britain flight, I actually landed on 220 airfields in 2 months, and I gave approximately 94 disabled people a flight on that round Britain flight, which was wonderful too. And several of them have gone on since then and done their flying training through the Flying Scholarships for Disabled. So that was very exciting to do as well.
Okay, let's go into your journey now. So you've got your PPL, you've circumnavigated Australia with Peter, your husband. So tell us about your solo trip across the Atlantic to the United States. Tell us that story.
I was actually, the way it came about was very interesting because we had planned, having flown around Australia, we thought, we'll hire an aeroplane and fly around America, because my husband's very interested in old warbirds and things, and we wanted to visit various sites where they had warbirds, and also our son was at university over there, so we wanted to visit him. So we thought we'd hire an aeroplane and fly around the States. And I mentioned this, I was at the time doing an instrument rating, which is a type of training which enables you to fly in bad weather, really, and is also, for me, an extra safety thing. And I was doing my instrument rating in Bristol, my training, and I said to my instructor, we're going to hire an aeroplane and fly around the States and Canada. And her response to me was, why are you hiring an aeroplane? You've got a perfectly good one yourself. And I thought, oh, wow, perhaps I could fly across to America and back again. And I wouldn't say I just got in and did it. I have to do a lot of preparation before you do these big flights. Yeah. That one sentence, it is quite amazing sometimes how someone will say something and not be conscious what they say, that changes everything for you, and it really did change my life, because it was my first solo transatlantic flight, and that was a big undertaking, a big challenge.
Wow, that one sentence that flight instructor said to you started off a whole chain of events, which, literally the rest is history. What was the situation with you? You know, why did you want to fly over solo? Was this for self-achievement, or did Peter just not want to go with you?
Well, it was two or three reasons, really. One is that Peter wasn't that keen to do it over the ocean, so much flying over the ocean. And two, I had to carry a lot of extra fuel because there's no refueling stops in the middle of the ocean. So I had to have extra tanks inside the aircraft. So it meant that I took all the seats out except for mine, and it was just full of fuel tank. So there really wasn't room for him either. And the amazing thing was that he flew Iceland Air up to Iceland and then across to Boston. And as he was flying Iceland Air, he went up to the cockpit, as you could in those days, because it was before 9/11, and he spoke to the pilot, and they called me up on the radio and talked to me as they flew overhead. That was a really amazing experience. Yeah. Then when I landed at Iceland, I landed at Reykjavik, and the commercial planes going to a place called 𝗘𝗏𝗴, and the pilot drove over from 𝗘𝗏𝗴 to Reykjavik, especially to meet me. So that was nice too.
That was absolutely lovely. At this point, when you were doing this flight, was this literally just your own personal endeavour that you wanted to achieve?
I had no publicity, no sponsors. I had no. I didn't do it for the Flying for Disabled at that point. But that gave me the idea to then fly around the world and do it for the Flying Scholarships for Disabled. And also, at that point, I obviously needed to get sponsorship to be able to do these things. And so then if you have sponsors, you do a lot more publicity. That I had some marvellous sponsorship. Everything in the flight was completely sponsored. So that helped me a lot.
Fantastic. Just before we go into some of the Wings Around the World challenge, why Flying Scholarships for the Disabled? What affiliated you to that particular charity?
Well, as I said, my husband and I learned to fly in Australia. And when we came back to live in this country, we'd had such a great time. We thought, well, we really would like to find something to be able to put back into aviation. And at that point, we heard about the Flying Scholarships for Disabled, and so made more inquiries and volunteered to help. And at the beginning, it was quite a small charity, and it was most of the scholarships were sponsored by King Hussein of Jordan, who'd been very involved with this right at the beginning of the formation of the charity in 1983, in memory of the very famous wartime pilot Sir 𝗍𝗶𝗿𝗆, who lost his legs before the World War II, and then went on to fly without any legs, fly Spitfires and Hurricanes, and actually became an ace pilot in the war. When he died in 1983 or 82, this charity was established in his memory, and King Hussein of Jordan was the main sponsor for it until he died in 1999. So, and then at that point, they really needed to raise funds for it, because his funding obviously stopped, and that's when I got really involved with using it, my flights, for fundraising as well as promoting it.
Wow, that's definitely a great cause and a great motivation for you as well. So going into the first Wings Around the World challenge, where you circumnavigated eastbound around the world, could you tell us some highlights from that trip?
Well, there were many, as you can imagine, and a few lowlights as well.
I can imagine.
Perhaps scary flying over the Pacific, having to stop in New Caledonia for 8 days because of a cyclone, which is like a hurricane, but in the southern hemisphere they call them cyclones. And really we had to sort of put my aircraft in a very safe hangar and batten down the hatches and just sit and wait for it all to blow away, literally. I think it was also very exciting as I flew in over the Timor Sea from Indonesia to Darwin in northern Australia. My husband had flown over to Australia on a commercial flight, and then the owner of the original 𝗘𝗏𝗴𝗀𝗃 that we hired, and his wife flew my husband up to Darwin, and they flew out over the Timor Sea to meet up with me in formation, and we flew in formation back into Darwin, which was very exciting. And I could look out of my window and see my husband sitting in the aeroplane just on my wing, which was great highlight.
That is lovely, absolutely lovely. And just going back, what made you decide to, obviously you had the cause that you were working with, what gave you the first idea to fly around the world? Was that you just wanted, right, let's go for the biggest challenge possible, or were you trying to emulate anybody?
So. No, I think I don't try not to emulate people, because I like to be myself, but basically I don't mean that in any trite or boastful way, but
no, I totally understand.
I think it was just that the challenge of flying across the North Atlantic had been very exciting, and I thought, well, what's the next challenge? And so the next challenge was really to fly solo around the world. But I have to say to you, at this point, the idea of flying over the poles was beginning to formulate. And it was my son that actually said to me, Mum, I think before you try to fly over the poles, I think you should fly around the world a more sort of usual way, and give yourself some street cred, So I listened to my children as always, and took his advice and flew around the world the sort of more normal way, over much more land, although there was still the Pacific to cross, and that gave me a lot of street cred, and all my sponsors really were very happy then to sponsor me for the big polar flight.
Wow, I love that. You listened to your son. So you came back from that around the world trip and you raised a lot of money. How much money did you raise in the end on that first trip?
Do you know, I'm not actually certain how much I raised on each trip, but I know that we've raised over £500,000, which is, for me, I was very excited about. And I know that some people managed to raise far, far more, but I did my best. And the exciting thing for me, apart from the money, was actually the fact that they started a similar charity in Australia, and subsequently they've started one in America as well. So that's really exciting. And the way I raised money was I invited people to have their names on my wings, and for a minimum of £25 donation to the Flying Scholarships for the Disabled, anybody could have their name on my wing. So I had all sorts of people, like schools and churches and individuals and families and dogs and cats and budgerigars and even 2 boa constrictors on my wings. So and that was great for me to look out and look at the wings and say, oh, there's so-and-so or so-and-so. And of course, a lot of them I didn't know, but we had on the second flight, I can't remember how many we had on the first flight, but on the second flight we had something like 1,400 names on the wings.
Wow, that flight must have been tiny. Those are the people giving money and donating money to the cause. But what about logistics and sponsorship for the actual flight, the fuel, yes. and how did you gather the sponsors to fill the flights?
Well, I was very, very lucky because I actually wrote to a company called Jeppesen, which is in aviation world is the most well-known producer of maps and charts, but they also do things like overflight clearances and handling and organization of fuel and the rest of it. And I wrote to them and said, could they sell me, this was before my first world flight, and said, could they sell me some secondhand maps cheap so that I could do my planning, and then I would buy the maps from them before I left. And they wrote back to me and said, well, why don't you come over to Germany and see us? They're based in Frankfurt. So I flew over to Frankfurt in my little aeroplane and met Alan Lathan, who was the guy in charge then of that sort of thing. And he says, he liked what I was doing. He liked it because I was doing it for the Flying for Disabled. And he said, we'll give you all your maps and charts. And I thought, is this me he's speaking to? And then he said, well, I'll speak to them at Gatwick, which is where they do all the handling and the overflight clearances and things. He said, they're very busy. I don't think they'll be interested, but I will tell them. And the next thing is I get a letter saying, come down to Gatwick. So I went down to Gatwick and they said, we get asked for sponsorship every week and they all go in the bin. But we really like what you're doing because you're doing it for the Flying Scholarships for Disabled. And so we'll do all your overflight clearances and all your handling and organise all the weather reports for you and everything all around the world. And so then when I had Jeppesen, and I worked very hard at promoting and advertising the fact that Jeppesen was supporting me, then all the others like Shell provided all my fuel. So they said, oh, is Jeppesen sponsoring you? We better sponsor you as well. And so if you've got one, then all the others sort of come on board. It was exciting. It was a bit like a snowball.
Yeah, I can imagine. It sounds like a roller coaster to me.
Sponsor in the end, and of course Birmingham International Airport, which is where I left and came back to. They were one of my major sponsors as well. And Sennheiser headsets, they were major sponsors, and Oris watches. It was they were all great. So I'm forever grateful because they made it all possible. Without their support, it would have been impossible to do.
And did you have obviously there's a lot of different companies there. Did you have like a project manager to sort of oversee and bring it all together, or was that you as well?
Well, me and my husband, and actually we had 5 members of the British Women Pilots Association who were a voluntary team, and they all helped enormously. And everybody pulled together. And actually, there's a lovely story about the names on the wings, because one of the 5 volunteers, Rosemary Taylor, did all the organisation of the names on the wings. If you wanted to have your name on the wing, you could apply on the website and it would go to Rosemary, or you could send her a form with the money and it would go to her, and then she'd organise it to be put on the wings and things. And she rang me on one occasion, and I don't know if you remember, but I said it's a minimum donation of £25 to the Flying Scholarships for Disabled. And she rang me one day and she said, I had this donation of £24 from this chap, so I thought, well, I'll add £1 and put his name on the wing. So I thought I'd ring him up. So I rang him up. She said, lucky he wasn't in, because when I put my glasses on, I missed 3 noughts and he'd sent a donation of £24,000.
Fantastic.
She was going to ring him up and say, I'll put £1 and put your name on the wing. So she said, thank goodness he wasn't in when I rang him up.
You'd probably say, we'll just put your first name on for that. You leave your last name off.
Well, it was very, very generous of him, and very, that was exciting, obviously, and fun. It was a fun story.
Wow, that is awesome. And just a quick one on some of the technical stuff. So how did you plan the route? Obviously, you met a lot of people around the world, and but how did you actually make, what direction and what countries and what?
Again, it starts off with and I started with an atlas and a pencil and a ruler, and I sort of drew lines of where I wanted to go, and then I had to look and see whether the airfield was suitable, whether I could fly over that particular country. You don't want to fly over war zones or anything. And then I had to look at things like, were the mountains too high for me to fly across? And so it sort of all started literally with a pencil and a ruler in my sitting room, and then I got the maps and charts and planned it all from there. And then in the end, I did all my own flight planning, but then in the end I gave it all to Jeppesen and they filed it all for me and everything. So that was marvellous. And then all the other sort of preparation, it isn't just flight planning. You have to make sure that you can get fuel. And in some places you can't get fuel, like up in the Arctic and the Antarctic, but that was my second flight, of course. And India, and places in India, I had to get it brought in on barrels. And in the middle of the Pacific, Christmas Island, I had to get that brought in a year in advance to make sure I had fuel. You don't want to get stranded somewhere like that in the middle of the Pacific. And so there's all that. And then I added to that, in a light aircraft, if you've got one engine and that engine fails, then you don't have too much choice as to where you're going to land. And so I thought it was very prudent, and I did a lot of preparation, survival training, and I did survival training with 2 ex-Marine commandos on desert and jungle survival, and I did ditching and dunking, learning how to survive in a life raft and how to get out of an aircraft that landed on the water, and do you attach your life raft to yourself or do you attach it to the aeroplane, because you don't want to see it blowing away in the wind if you land successfully. And then, of course, for my polar flight, I did a lot of ice survival training, went to Alaska and learned how to survive in very, very bad cold conditions, and that was very interesting and challenging as well. I think the training was almost as challenging as the flight itself. But if you prepare really well for something, then generally things go reasonably smoothly.
Did you feel that, an increase in your own confidence that, hey, after you've got all this training and, if anything were to happen, did you feel that you were in a better place than you were prior?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think if I hadn't done that training, I don't even know if I would have done it. I'm sort of a bit of a wimp, really, underneath. I think, well, you've got to give yourself the best chance. So it's worth the effort of really preparing really well before you go. And I was really grateful for the survival training. And before both my major world flights, I did survival training. So I repeated some of it, like the ditching and dunking again between the two flights, because I felt you can't prepare yourself well enough. You've got to really, really do your homework. It's your life at stake, so it's important. Even learnt with the Marine commanders how to resist or how to cope with kidnapping and kidnappers and that sort of thing. So it was, thank goodness I didn't have to put any of that into practice.
I can imagine you're a very dangerous lady now.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, the other thing, of course, for the Arctic flight, I had to learn how to shoot in case I came across a polar bear. And I had to get a firearms license and I had a .303 rifle, and I carried that fully loaded with me all the time I was in the Arctic, because I didn't want to become a polar bear dinner, really. And so luckily I didn't come face to face with a polar bear, but if I had done the training and knew how to use the gun, and hopefully I'd have put enough bullets in it to shut it up.
I love your pragmatic approach, and the way you said earlier that I'm a bit of a wimp. Really? You're fooling me anyway.
I think I am, because basically I felt it was so important to really, really take learn everything I could and try everything I could to make it as safe as possible. And after all, the aeroplane doesn't know it's over water or over the ice or anything like that. So, why should it stop? If you prepare it all properly, then it's not going to stop, Absolutely. Although having said that, it did stop.
Tell me what happened then.
It stopped when I was flying out from northern Norway and Svalbard, which is up at Spitsbergen, a group of islands north of Norway. I'd landed there and waited for 10 days for good weather to cross the North Pole. And I took off from there slightly, sort of, obviously a little bit worried about what was going to happen. But eventually you just keep going. And I flew over the North Pole and then down towards northern Canada. And I'd used all the fuel inside the aircraft, which you have to do first. You always use that before you use the fuel in the wings. And I'd done 12 out of 14 hours, and I'd used up all the fuel inside, and I changed onto the wing tank, and I had another 2 hours to run, and I had 6 hours of fuel in the wing tanks. And at that point, the engine stopped. And I thought, my God, I'd done a lot of training and I did all the right things and I got it going again. But it was after I'd got it going again, I thought, oh my goodness, how would I manage? If I'd landed safely on the ice, how would I manage if I came across a polar bear? How would I manage to survive? Who would come and fetch me? How would my husband manage without me?
Exactly. These are the questions we need answering.
Yeah, so luckily, and then of course the rest of the 2 hours I was thinking, why did it stop? I didn't know why it had stopped. Was the ice in the fuel? What was the reason for it stopping? And
did you find out?
So all the time I kept saying, please don't stop again, please don't stop again. So it spoiled the flight for me, that because I was so worried after that. It didn't stop again, and I found out later that it was actually caused by an airlock when I was changing tanks. Air had got into the fuel lines and stopped the flow of fuel. So
disinduced. Okay.
Yeah. And the other interesting thing about flying over the North Pole was when I had a satellite phone on board, and when I got to the North Pole and the GPS read 90 north, 90 north is right at the top of the world, and I thought, I was so excited. If I'd had a table, I would have danced on it, but I didn't have room for a table to dance on. So I rang my husband from the North Pole, and he was back in Oxfordshire here, and I said, I'm on top of the world, and he goes, for heaven's sake, head south, which of course I did.
In every direction, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So yes, it's quite difficult. You have to work out exactly the right direction, because otherwise you could just go round and round in circles at the North Pole. It's all white. You don't know, where you lose all sense of direction. The compass doesn't work, and so you have to take sun sights and rely on your GPS. So all that's very exciting stuff too.
Wow. What happens when you actually, in terms of from your compass point of view, does it really go crazy, like when you're approaching the 90 north?
Oh, long before then, it about 60, 70 north, starts to go all funny, tip up, and you think, oh, goodness, now I haven't got a compass, But I had already started taking sun sights. I'd had to learn how to do navigation by the sun, and I had the special instrument on my dashboard, and every 20 minutes I took sun sights and plotted my route just in case the GPS failed. But luckily the GPS didn't fail, but I sort of cross-checked them all the time. And the old-fashioned way of navigating by the sun was very accurate, really. So that was, quite amazing.
Psychologically, on those long legs, I know I read that one of the legs on one of the trips was 16 hours over Hawaii. And what were you thinking about? What were you doing? Obviously, you're checking the systems, but what's going on?
Well, if you do a long journey this is what I do on a long journey like 16 hours. I'm very, very busy. The worst time is actually leaving the land behind you, and you think, oh, do I really want to do this? And then you get down to it. I have an hourly routine. I knew it was going to be about 16 hours, so I put 16 little lines on my notepad, and every time it came to the hour, I crossed one off, and every hour I had a routine. So I had to check all the gauges and check the fuel and do all the fuel calculations, and then I had to report my position to air traffic control. I had to work out my next position and tell them roughly when to expect me to call again, and then I'd have to eat something and drink something, and then I did exercises to keep the circulation going, because you don't want to get a deep vein thrombosis. And I was gathering some information for two research students, and so I had to fill in lots of forms for them. And before I knew where I was, the next hour had come around, and so actually it doesn't, and I'm quite good at sort of organising that type of and sitting there for that length of time, and I seem to quite enjoy doing it. I don't know why, really. It seems a bit masochistic, doesn't it? But
it sounds very mentally. You must have been exhausted.
Much more exhausted when I landed, because most places I landed, because I had sponsors and because I wanted to promote the flying for disabled, I had to do like television and radio and receptions and give talks. And then I found that very tiring. And then I'd get to my bed maybe about midnight, and then I'd have to get out my flight plans for the next day, make sure I had all the right clothes to wear and the right plans, and then I had to do it's like a blog, but it was in those days it was I had a website, and I had to send back emails to my team at home to put on the website, where my diary, and it was usually sort of 1 or 2 in the morning before I get to bed, and then be up at 6 to get the next day's flight. So that was exhausting, but it was, in a way, it was more relaxing being in the aeroplane on my own, because I had a job to do and wasn't sort of at the beck and call of everybody, who I wanted to be. Don't get it wrong. I really, I wanted the publicity because I wanted to thank my sponsors, and I wanted to promote the flying for disabled. So all that, was part and parcel of it. But that was the most tiring.
Wow, totally understand that. And just quickly before we move on, where was the most fun place to fly?
The most fun place to fly? I did really love Argentina. Absolutely loved Argentina. I think the people there were marvellous, and the Argentine Air Force looked after me the whole time. And that brings me to the point when I got to the Antarctic and I tried to cross the Antarctic. I got sort of halfway across, and the headwinds were so strong that it was going to take too long. I was going to use up all my fuel, and I had to take an awful decision of turning around and coming back again. But then in the Antarctic, there is no fuel for these light aircraft. You have to get it shipped down the year before. And there I was, stuck in the Antarctic with no fuel to get out.
Wow.
And the Argentine Air Force sent a 𝗟𝗲𝗴𝗰𝗀𝗀, one of those great big Hercules airplanes, down to their base on an island called 𝗟𝗴𝗴𝗰𝘀 in the Antarctic Peninsula. And they sent a Hercules all the way down from Argentina, purely with my 4 barrels of fuel on board. So they were fantastic. The Argentines, they were just marvellous to me. And so I had enough fuel to fly from the 𝗍𝗏 base, which is a British base, up to 𝗟𝗴𝗴𝗀 and refuel there to get back to the mainland Argentina. So
wow, what a gesture.
marvellous. And they looked after me. They were just wonderful. Yes, they were just a fantastic attitude, You come and stay on our base, we'll look after you, and all the rest of it. They were just so hospitable, very nice. So Argentina was one of my favourites. I love Australia, of course. Flying in Australia is so free, and there's miles and miles and miles of land without, hundreds of aeroplanes flying and lots of noise on the radio and all that stuff. It's very peaceful. I think I enjoyed everywhere, really. There were a few bureaucratic frustrations in India, but I had a great time there. So and was really greeted like royalty. So it was all great fun.
Wow,
I was very privileged.
Yeah, very privileged, and you're very humble with it, which is lovely.
Yeah, it was just a wonderful thing to do, and I was just so lucky to have done it, and it's a great memory to have. I've finished now. I won't do. I won't do any more long distance flying. I'm still flying for fun, and I hope I can continue to do that. But I think I've done enough long distance flying. It's time for somebody else to do those things, So.
It's funny because when you did your around Great Britain challenge,
Yeah.
That was when I was actually learning to fly. So back in 2007, and
cool.
I remember I was flying out around the Cotswolds, and you were literally, it was when you flew into Heathrow, and they obviously made a big deal about that with the single engine aircraft. And I remember going, wow, look at, I thought, wow, that's amazing. One day I'm going to do that. But then my instructor promptly told me that, no, you're not. not in a single engine aircraft anyway. And
Are you still flying?
Oh yeah. I'm flying a PA-28, not the big Dakota, but the PA-28 161 and a Cessna 182.
Oh, lovely. Excellent. Yes, that's great fun. I think they're really fun to fly this, yeah. Oh, well, one day you might fly into Heathrow, but I had a lot of trouble getting permission to do so because they don't allow light aircraft into Heathrow, and I had to go in at midnight, which was the only time when the big jets aren't flying in there, so I wouldn't hold anybody up by coming too slowly in on approach and things. But the Heathrow controller was fantastic because he didn't want to let me go because he was bored. He still had to be there in spite of there being no traffic because of the noise abatement. They're not allowed traffic into Heathrow after, I don't know what time, 10 o'clock or 10:30 or 11 or something, and until 4 or 5 in the morning. And so the controllers have to be there in case somebody has to divert into Heathrow for mechanical reasons or something. And so he was just bored and hung on to me, wanted to talk to me, all the way back as far as Brize Norton, where I was landing, because we didn't have lights where I keep the aircraft. So I had to go back into Brize Norton, and he hung on to me for as long as he could. He wasn't going to hand me over to another controller. So it was a very exciting thing to do. I've flown into lots and lots of major airports, but forbidden fruits are always more exciting. And the fact that you're forbidden to fly into Heathrow, and I managed to get permission with the help of a lot of people trying, gunning for me and helping to get me that permission, then it was a very exciting thing to do. Oh, in the end, it's just another runway like anywhere else.
Don't tell us that, Polly. Tell us it's magical and there's lots of fairies. And
I'm not allowed to go in there, so it was magical, and it was a very exciting thing to do.
Fantastic.
And I went as slowly as I possibly could as well, so I could enjoy every moment of it.
You must have seen so many things across, everywhere. I hope you did manage to take everything, some of the good stuff in.
The thing that amazed me, Marvin, was actually when you look down, wherever you were in the world, because I always had a topographical map with me, was you look down and there it was the map, absolutely as it's mapped, and it always sort of I know it's bound to be, but it sort of surprised me somehow, that if there was a little bay here, or or we're going up the coast, or there was mountains here, or field or woods here, then
They
they were
was.
there on the map. Yes.
It's kind of novel, but I understand what you're talking about. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that you're still flying. So just can you tell us about your current flying now? Obviously, you stepped down from the world tours. What are you doing now? What's your
Yes.
typical Polly
Well,
flight?
sometimes we think, let's go off and have lunch somewhere. So we do that. And sometimes people ask me to give them a flight, and that really gives me the most pleasure because I like to share it with other people. It's given me a great time, and so if I can share it with somebody else, that's great. You have to come fly with me one day, Marvin.
Yeah, we'll take you up on that. Yeah.
Yeah, you're welcome to. And then just once or twice a year, we fly perhaps somewhere in Europe. Like last year, we went to Verona and to Venice, and we took some friends with us, so that was great. And we stopped off on the way, and so it was a sort of fun holiday to have. And the year before, we went. Peter and I flew ourselves to the Ukraine, and thank goodness we went then because things are not so bright there now, and I don't think we'd be allowed to go in there now. Whereas then it was marvellous. We went with a group of flyers, and I think there were about 30 aircraft or something flew into the Ukraine, and we were treated like royalty there and had a marvellous time. That's what saddens me there now, but not getting into political things.
Yeah, I think there's a significant no time out. Well, it's been out for a while now, but at least you enjoyed that anyway. That's awesome.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Whatever comes. That's the thing.
Okay, Polly. So now that you've put conquering the world aviation-wise behind you, what are your future plans or aspirations?
I've decided that it was going to be quite difficult to give up world flying because you get into the sort of habit of it, really, I suppose, and it's like a drug. You want to do more and more. But I realised that that it's ridiculous to keep on going on doing it, and it's much better to stop, make a clean break. So I decided that I'd needed another challenge. So I went off and learned. I'd never had equines in my life before, and I went off and learned how to look after donkeys. And I bought 2 donkeys, baby donkeys, and I've trained them to drive. And I drive a carriage now, and with my 2 donkeys, and that's great fun as well.
That's very grounding.
Yeah,
that's awesome.
You live in the past, and you have to move forward. You have to put the past behind you. So it's great to talk about it, but then you have to forget about it and move on. And so we do lots of things with my donkeys now. We give people rides. We go to the village fetes. We go to church on Palm Sunday with them, and so that's given me a new lease of life, really.
Fantastic. Okay, Polly, this is my favourite part of the show. This is the quick fire checklist. This is where I ask you a series of questions, and you come back to us, the inspired pilots, with amazing and inspiring answers. How does that sound?
Oh, I don't know, a bit frightening, really. Go on then.
Okay, if you can circumnavigate the globe, I'm sure you can get through the quickfire checklist. What is the best piece of advice related to flying that you've ever received?
Good, careful, precise preparation for every flight. And I will tell you an interesting story here because I very quickly, I know it's quick fire, but I'm going to tell you this.
No, go for it.
I took a friend of mine who's a very senior surgeon. In fact, he was president of the Royal College of Surgeons. And I took him for a flight after my second world flight. And I said, after I had given him a flight, he said, Polly, I can't believe that you've flown around the world twice and you're still using a checklist. And I said to him, Bernie, that's why I'm still here. And he said, I'm going to instigate that for surgeons. He said, I think if surgeons had checklists in their surgery, they would not find they get halfway through the surgery and have got the wrong x-rays or whatever. And that has actually happened. So I'm very excited that it all stemmed from flying. So
wow, that's an awesome story.
Yeah.
Do you have a favourite internet flying resource that you'd like to share with the listeners?
Not really. I'm terribly sorry. I'm awfully not internet I'm not into the internet too much. I'm sorry, Mervyn.
𝗂𝗶𝗍𝗃 doesn't have to apologise to me for that. No worries.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you share one of your personal habits that you find useful and believe contributes to your flying success?
Well, I don't know if you call it a habit, but I am a very deeply believing Christian, and there's a lovely story attached to that too. Because as I flew into 𝗂𝗶𝗃𝗃 in Brazil, I landed, and the handler there was a really nice chap called Louis, and I had, as I told you, taken all the seats out of the aircraft except mine, and I had all the rest were fuel tanks. And Louis said to me, "You know, you've got 2 seats in your aircraft." And I looked at him really puzzled. I thought, what's the guy mean? And he said, "Yes, one for you and one for God." And I thought that was lovely. And that really carried me around the world.
He only needs a little seat. He doesn't need a full one. So yeah, he was definitely there with you. Okay, trikes or tail draggers?
Golf Foxtrot Romeo Golf November, my 𝗘𝗶𝗀𝗃𝗃 is a trike. I have done some tail dragger training, and my husband, whose main hobby is rebuilding old aircraft, is in the process of rebuilding a leopard moth, and I want to fly that, so I shall have to go and do some more training to, make sure I'm really good on the tail dragging before I fly this beautiful aeroplane that will be once he's rebuilt it. So yeah, I like them both. All aeroplanes are great. I've had a go at helicopters too, and they're fun. So I wish I had the money to go and learn to fly helicopters, but I don't think that's going to happen. So I'm enjoying flying whatever I can.
Fantastic. Can you recommend one aviation-related book?
Why not mine? Wings Around the World.
Wings Around the World.
That's very arrogant, isn't it?
That is very self-serving, but I'll let you have that. No problem.
It does actually promote the flying scholarships for disabled, and if people do buy it, then most of the profits, or all the profits, and most of the money from the purchase goes to the flying scholarships for disabled. So that must be the favourite aviation book to promote, mustn't it?
It is indeed. And I actually bought my copy last night on Amazon. So yeah, I'm just waiting for it to arrive.
Oh, great. Yeah.
Okay. What is your favourite non-essential but essential to you technology gadget in your cockpit?
Well, as I told you, I'm a bit of an old-fashioned person, I suppose, because I'm just happy to have a Bendix King KLN 90B GPS, which has stood me in good stead. It's very old, but it's still recognised for IFR flying, so instrument rating flying. So it stood me in good stead. I don't need anything new. I don't have a glass cockpit or anything. I'm a technophobe, really. I don't really like screens and gadgets and things. So I'm very sorry to disappoint you on that one, Marvin. I'm an old-fashioned pilot, just seat of the pants and a few gadgets, and that's it.
Fantastic. I'll take that. If you had a time machine that could go back in time and meet your younger self just as you're about to start your flying journey, knowing what you know now, what advice would you give yourself?
I don't really know, because I think I enjoyed every minute. Enjoy as much as you can. I mean, I think my advice is a life thing, really. Try to look for all the good things in life and don't look at the bad things, and put the bad things behind you, because we all have bad times, and put them behind you. Look for the good things, and there were so many good things, and there are so many good things. It's a wonderful world we live in, and that's my advice, if anything, is enjoy as much as you can. Don't get bogged down with all the miserable things.
Exactly. Stay positive.
Yeah, sorry.
No problem. Okay, Inspired Pilots, you can find all the links to all the resources and everything else we've been talking about in today's episode by going to inspiredpilot.com and search for Polly in the search bar to find the show notes for this episode. Okay, Polly, listening to your journey and the stories you've shared have been very inspiring, and I'm sure we could have been talking for at least 2 days just to go through all the details. I'm looking forward to receiving my book as soon as it comes, and I'll definitely go through that and find out more of the nitty-gritty. You've inspired me personally, and I know the listeners will find your story very inspiring too. Can you give us one last piece of guidance for our audience of inspired pilots, and then share how people can get in contact with you, and then we'll sign off?
Well, I think always pay attention to checks and detail, and also always pay attention to the weather. And if you're a little anxious about the weather, don't go it's always another day. Don't try to be too clever with it all, because I find, and that's why I'm still alive, and that's the best bit of advice I could give you. My website is very out of date. It's www.worldwings.org. It's still there, but I haven't updated it for ages. So if you want to get in touch with me, it's 𝗑𝗽𝗚𝗀𝗃@aol.com. And Marvin, don't forget that flight.
Don't worry. I'm definitely going to throw some dates out to you as soon as possible. Okay, Polly, thank you for joining us on the show today, for being so generous with your time. It's been an absolute privilege on my behalf. And on behalf of the Inspired Pilots, I'd like to say thank you and speak to you again.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for joining us today on the Inspired Pilot podcast. Don't forget to head over to inspiredpilot.com. That's where you'll find the show notes for every episode, links to all the resources mentioned, and much, much more. Wherever you are on your pilot journey, get ready to be inspired.